There's a certain kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't swagger into rooms or make threats. It sits quietly in the corner, calculating, watching, building systems that will outlast any individual voice raised in anger. Meyer Lansky understood that kind of power. While other mobsters became famous for their violence, their flashy lifestyles, their brutal reputations, Lansky became powerful for something far more dangerous. He understood money, how it moved, how it hid, how it multiplied. Born Meyer Lansky in a small town in the Russian Empire, he would die as Meyer Lansky in Miami Beach. In between those 2 points, he helped design the architecture of modern organized crime. Not through murder, though he sanctioned plenty of it. Not through intimidation, though he inspired plenty of that too. Through structure, through finance, through the patient work of turning criminal enterprises into something that looked almost legitimate, almost respectable, almost impossible to prosecute. They called him the mob's accountant, but that title understates what he actually was. Meyer Lansky was an architect. He built the framework that allowed organized crime to evolve from street gangs into a national syndicate, from prohibition bootlegging into global casino empires, from crude extortion into sophisticated money laundering. His story stretches from the poverty of New York's Lower East Side to the casinos of Havana, from the neon lights of Las Vegas to the secret banking halls of Switzerland, from friendships formed on immigrant streets to betrayals played out in the highest levels of government. This is not a story about a traditional mob boss. There are no dramatic shootouts defining Meyer Lansky's career. No public displays of power, no theatrical violence. This is something more subtle, more lasting, more influential. This is the story of how one immigrant kid with a gift for numbers changed organized crime forever. How he built an empire that spanned continents. How he accumulated and lost a fortune that people still search for today. And how, in the end, despite all his careful planning and brilliant strategy, he died almost penniless in Miami Beach, leaving behind questions that have never been fully answered. Was Meyer Lansky the criminal mastermind who hid $300 million? Or was he just another immigrant who bet everything on the American dream and lost? The answer, like everything about Meyer Lansky, is more complicated than it first appears. This is that story. Chapter 1. Grodno to the Lower East Side. The story begins far from America, in a small city called Grodno, part of the Russian Empire in 1902. Today it's in Belarus. Then it was just another place where Jewish families tried to survive in a world that often didn't want them. July 4th, 1902. A boy was born to a Polish Jewish family. His parents named him Meyer Lansky. It's a name that would disappear eventually, replaced by something that sounded more American, more simple, more suited to the life he would build. But in 1902, in Grodno, he was just another child in a community facing constant pressure. Pogroms, economic discrimination, the everyday violence of being Jewish in the Russian Empire. His father made the decision that millions of other fathers made during that era. He left, traveled to America. The plan was to establish himself, save money, then send for his family. It took 9 years. 1911. Meyer, his mother, and his brother finally made the journey. They traveled through Odessa, boarded a ship, and sailed toward a country they'd only heard about in letters and stories. They arrived in New York and settled in the Lower East Side. For immigrants arriving in the early 20th century, the Lower East Side was both a landing place and a proving ground. Crowded tenement buildings, multiple families sharing single apartments, streets filled with people speaking dozens of languages. It was poverty, real poverty, the kind where children worked instead of playing, where families shared meals that weren't quite enough, where survival required constant hustle and adaptability. But it was also opportunity. The old rules didn't apply here. The social hierarchies that had kept certain families down for generations were fluid in New York. You could remake yourself. You could become someone different. Young Meyer learned English. He went to school, though not for long. The family needed income more than they needed his education. He learned to navigate the streets, to spot opportunities, to understand the various systems, legal and illegal, that made the Lower East Side function. This was a neighborhood where organized crime wasn't something separate from daily life. It was woven into the fabric of how things worked. Protection rackets, gambling operations, street gangs controlling different blocks. As a teenager, Meyer was small, physically unimposing, not the type who would naturally gravitate toward street violence. But he was smart, quick with numbers, able to see patterns that others missed. He met other young men trying to make their way in this world. Benjamin Siegel, who everyone would eventually call Bugsy, though never to his face. Siegel was different from Meyer, handsome, charismatic, volatile, quick to violence. They became friends, an unlikely pairing in some ways, the cautious numbers kid and the unpredictable enforcer. But it worked. They understood each other's strengths. They complemented each other. Together they started running small gambling operations. Dice games, card games, nothing major at first, just kids trying to earn money in a neighborhood where legitimate opportunities were scarce. They formed what became known as the Bugs and Meyer Mob, a small crew that protected its gambling games through reputation and willingness to use violence when necessary. Siegel provided the violence. Meyer provided the organization. During this period, Meyer also encountered another young man who would shape his future, Charles Luciano. Lucky, people called him. The story goes that Luciano tried to extort money from Meyer's gambling operation. Just another street shakedown. Young thugs trying to establish territory and extract tribute from anyone operating within it. Meyer refused to pay. Most people, faced with Luciano's crew, would have backed down, would have paid the money and accepted their place in the local hierarchy. But Meyer saw something different. He saw that Luciano's demand wasn't strategic. It was just tradition, just the way things had always been done. His refusal impressed Luciano. Here was someone willing to push back, someone who thought about power differently than the typical street tough. Instead of violence, they started talking, and from those conversations came a relationship that would eventually reshape organized crime in America. Luciano understood force. Meyer understood finance. Together, they began to imagine something bigger than street gangs fighting over blocks. By the time Meyer was in his late teens, he'd established a reputation in the Lower East Side. Not as a fighter, but as someone who could run an operation, who could keep books, who could be trusted with money. These might seem like small skills, mundane even, but in a world where most criminals were impulsive, violent, and unsophisticated, someone who could actually manage money was rare, valuable. Meyer was learning lessons that would serve him for decades. How to stay in the background, how to let flashier personalities take the spotlight while you controlled the actual operations. How to build systems that didn't depend on any single person's reputation or violence. He was also learning about the legitimate world, about how businesses actually functioned, about banking, about contracts, about the legal frameworks that allowed money to move and grow. Other young criminals saw the legal world and the illegal world as separate. Opposed, Meyer saw them as connected, overlapping. He saw that the skills legitimate businessmen used, accounting, investment, long-term planning, could be applied to criminal enterprises. This insight would make him rich. It would make him powerful. And it would make him one of the most important figures in 20th century organized crime. But first, America had to make a catastrophic mistake. A mistake that would turn millions of people into criminals overnight and create opportunities that young men like Meyer Lansky could barely imagine. 1920 was coming, and with it, prohibition. Chapter 2. Prohibition and the Education of a Financial Genius. January 17th, 1920. The 18th Amendment went into effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal throughout the United States. The goal was noble, at least in theory. Reduce alcohol consumption, improve public health, strengthen families, create a more moral society. What actually happened was one of the greatest economic opportunities in American criminal history. Millions of Americans still wanted to drink. Demand didn't disappear just because supply became illegal. Someone was going to meet that demand. Someone was going to make enormous amounts of money doing it. Meyer Lansky, he'd Americanized his name by now, shedding Meyer Lansky for something that fit better in his new country, saw prohibition as something different from what most criminals saw. Most saw quick money, fast cash from selling illegal booze. Meyer saw infrastructure. He saw the need for supply chains, distribution networks, protection arrangements, and financial systems to handle massive cash flows. The bugs in Meyer mob expanded from small-time gambling into bootlegging. But they didn't just sell liquor on street corners. They thought bigger. They established relationships with Canadian suppliers who could provide quality alcohol. They organized transportation networks to move product from the border to New York. They developed distribution systems to get alcohol to speakeasies, restaurants, and private buyers. And they worked within a larger ecosystem. They weren't operating alone. They were part of networks that included older, more established criminals. Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, was one of the major Italian crime figures in New York. Meyer and Luciano operated in his orbit, learning from his organization while building their own power base. Another influential figure during this period was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was different from the typical gangster. He wore expensive suits. He fixed sporting events, including allegedly the 1919 World Series. He understood corruption at the highest levels of society. Rothstein became something of a mentor to the younger generation of criminals. He showed them that crime didn't have to be street level, that with enough sophistication, you could corrupt judges, politicians, police chiefs. You could operate in plain sight, protected by the very people who were supposed to be stopping you. Meyer absorbed these lessons. He watched Rothstein operate. He saw how money and influence could provide protection that violence alone never could. During the 1920s, Meyer's reputation evolved. He wasn't known as a tough guy. That was Siegel's role. Meyer was the one who kept the books, who made sure everyone got paid properly, who could tell you exactly how much profit an operation generated and where every dollar went. This might not sound impressive compared to the violence and drama of the bootlegging wars. But in an environment where most criminals couldn't read financial statements, where disputes often arose from confusion about money, Meyer's skills made him invaluable. He developed a particular style during these years. Calm, soft-spoken. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He just presented facts, presented numbers, and let those facts drive decisions. Other mobsters were hot-tempered. They made decisions based on emotion, on pride, on personal slights. Meyer made decisions based on profit and sustainability. This difference in approach would eventually make him one of the most powerful men in organized crime. But it would also make him different from the traditional image of a mob boss. Less visible, less dramatic, less likely to end up in headlines or history books. The 1920s Rahias were also when Meyer started building bridges between different ethnic criminal groups. This was revolutionary. Traditionally, Italian gangs worked with Italians, Jewish gangs with Jews, Irish with Irish. There was cooperation sometimes, but also constant tension and violence over territory. Meyer, along with Luciano, started imagining something different. What if these groups cooperated systematically? What if they divided territory logically, rather than fighting over it constantly? What if they pooled resources for operations that were too big for any single gang? These were business questions, not emotional ones, and Meyer was perfectly suited to ask them. The networks they built during Prohibition, the relationships, the trust, the shared operations, would form the foundation for something much larger, something that would reshape American organized crime. But first, the old guard had to fall. The late 1920s and early 1930s saw massive violence in the New York underworld. The Castellammarese War, they called it, a power struggle between old-world Italian bosses who clung to traditional hierarchies and rules. Luciano and Meyer saw the war as wasteful. It killed people. It disrupted business. It attracted law enforcement attention. It was, fundamentally, bad for profit. They began planning something audacious. They would end the war by eliminating the bosses on both sides. They would create a new structure, something more rational, more corporate, almost. The violence came in 1931. Joe Masseri was killed. Salvatore Maranzano, his rival, took power briefly before being killed himself. When the smoke cleared, Luciano was the most powerful Italian mobster in New York, and Meyer Lansky was his closest advisor and partner. Together, they started building something unprecedented in American crime, something that would come to be known as the National Crime Syndicate. Chapter 3. The Syndicate and the Accountant's Role. The National Crime Syndicate wasn't a formal organization with bylaws and officers. It was more subtle than that, more flexible, but also more powerful. The basic idea was simple. Instead of different gangs constantly fighting over territory and resources, why not create a system where disputes were mediated, where large operations were coordinated, where everyone could make more money through cooperation than through conflict? Luciano organized the Italian side into what became known as the Commission, a board of directors, essentially, for the Italian-American Mafia. Different families, different territories, but all agreeing to certain rules, all recognizing certain boundaries. Meyer's role was different. He wasn't Italian, so he couldn't be part of the formal mafia structure. But that actually gave him more flexibility. He could work with everyone. He could be the bridge between Italian families and Jewish criminals, between New York and other cities, between the old bootlegging networks and new opportunities. He became, in effect, the financial strategist for the entire syndicate, the person who could analyze an operation and tell you whether it made sense, the person who could structure deals so that everyone got their fair share, the person who understood both the legal and illegal sides of money well enough to move between them. This was the period when Meyer Lansky became the mob's accountant. The title was both accurate and understated. He kept books, yes, but he also designed the systems those books tracked. One of the syndicate's most notorious operations was Murder Incorporated, an enforcement arm that carried out contract killings on behalf of syndicate leadership. Meyer supported Murder Incorporated financially and strategically, but he kept himself distant from the actual violence. He understood that the people who pulled triggers often ended up dead or in prison. The people who planned operations and managed money had longer careers. This wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. Meyer had watched enough criminals get caught or killed because they couldn't separate themselves from violence. He wasn't going to make that mistake. The 1930s saw a massive expansion of syndicate operations. Prohibition ended in 1933, taking away the enormous bootlegging profits. But the networks remained. The relationships remained. The organizational structures remained. The syndicate pivoted to other operations. Gambling became a primary focus. Also loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, and legitimate businesses that could be used for money laundering. Meyer was instrumental in all of it. He helped establish gambling operations in multiple cities. He developed the financial structures that allowed criminal profits to be invested in legitimate businesses. He created the early versions of what would later become sophisticated money laundering systems. He also started thinking about a particular opportunity, something that combined his interest in gambling with his understanding of law and finance. Legal casinos. In most of America, casino gambling was illegal, but not everywhere. Nevada had legalized it in 1931. And there were rumors of other places, Cuba, for instance, where the right connections could make casino operations possible. Meyer saw something that many criminals missed. Legal casinos offered a perfect cover for illegal operations. You had massive cash flows that were difficult to track. You had a legitimate business that could explain wealth. You had opportunities to skim profits before they were officially recorded. It was brilliant, really. Why break the law to run an illegal casino when you could run a legal casino and break the law in how you managed its money? This insight would define Meyer's next 30 years. He would become one of the most important figures in the development of legalized gambling in America and the Caribbean, not as a public face, but as a financial architect and hidden partner. But he needed the right opportunities, the right locations, the right political connections. The first major opportunity came in the 1940s. His old friend Bugsy Siegel had an idea. A crazy idea, many people thought. He wanted to build a luxury resort casino in the middle of the Nevada desert, a place called Las Vegas. Now, Chapter 4. Vegas, the Flamingo, and Bugsy's Fate. Las Vegas. In the 1940s was not what it would become. It was a small desert town, a railroad stop, a place with legalized gambling, yes, but nothing glamorous. Nothing that suggested it would eventually become the entertainment capital of the world. Benjamin Siegel saw potential where others saw wasteland. He'd been sent to Los Angeles by the syndicate in the late 1930s to oversee West Coast operations. He'd fallen in love with California, with Hollywood, with the lifestyle of the rich and famous. He started imagining a casino that combined gambling with luxury, a place that would attract wealthy tourists, Hollywood stars, high rollers from across the country. Not a dingy gambling hall, but a resort, a destination. The project was called the Flamingo, and it was ambitious in a way that made other mobsters nervous. Siegel needed money, a lot of money. Building a luxury resort in the desert was expensive. He went to the syndicate bosses for backing. Meyer Lansky was instrumental in getting that backing. He argued for the project. He explained the financial potential. He helped structure the investment so that multiple syndicate figures had stakes in it. Construction began in 1946, and almost immediately, problems emerged. The budget exploded. Siegel was building something more elaborate than originally planned. Materials were expensive. Labor was expensive. Everything was expensive. Worse, money started disappearing. Millions of dollars that should have gone into construction seemed to vanish. The other investors started suspecting that Siegel was skimming, that he was stealing from his own project. Siegel denied it. He blamed his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, for mismanagement. He blamed contractors for overcharging. He blamed everyone except himself. But the numbers didn't lie, and Meyer Lansky, more than anyone else, could read those numbers. By late 1946, the syndicate bosses were furious. They'd invested heavily in Siegel's vision, and the returns weren't materializing. The Flamingo opened in December 1946 and initially struggled. It reopened in March 1947 with better results, but the financial damage was already done. A meeting was called in Havana, Cuba, where Meyer and other syndicate figures were attending a larger conference. The topic was simple: what to do about Bugsy Siegel. Some wanted him killed immediately. He'd lost millions of their dollars. He'd proven unreliable. He was a liability. Meyer argued for patience. Give Siegel time to make the casino work. Give him a chance to pay back the investment. Remember his decades of service to the organization. Meyer and Siegel went back to childhood. They'd built the Bugs and Meyer mob together. They'd survived prohibition together. They'd helped create the syndicate together. But friendship only went so far in this world, and the other bosses were not convinced by Meyer's arguments. June 20th, 1947. Benjamin Siegel was sitting in the living room of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion, reading a newspaper, relaxed, not expecting trouble. Multiple gunshots shattered the window. Siegel was killed instantly. One of the most famous mob hits in American history. No one was ever officially charged with ordering it. But everyone knew the syndicate was responsible. And everyone knew that Meyer Lansky, despite his personal friendship with Siegel, hadn't been able to save him. Some accounts suggest Meyer tried harder to protect Siegel than the historical record shows. Others suggest he ultimately agreed that Siegel had to go. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Meyer was pragmatic. When friendship conflicted with business and survival, business usually won. What happened next at the Flamingo is telling. Almost immediately after Siegel's death, new management took over. The casino's finances were reorganized. And it started making money. Real money. Siegel's vision had been correct. A luxury resort casino in Las Vegas could work. It just needed better management. Over the next decade, the syndicate quietly took control of multiple Las Vegas properties. Not through public ownership, Nevada gaming regulations were tightening, but through frontmen, hidden partnerships, and carefully structured arrangements. Meyer Lansky was instrumental in these structures. He helped design the financial systems that allowed syndicate figures to profit from Las Vegas, while keeping their names off official documents. The technique was called skimming. Before the casino's profits were officially recorded and taxed, cash would be diverted, taken off the top, distributed to hidden partners. It was elegant in its way. The casino appeared to be making a certain amount of money. Taxes were paid on that amount. But the real money, the skimmed cash, never appeared in the books. Meyer had helped design these systems. He understood exactly how much you could skim without making the official numbers look suspicious. He knew how to move that cash without leaving obvious trails. But Las Vegas, for all its importance, was just one piece of Meyer's expanding empire. He was building something much larger, something international. He was building a casino network that stretched across the Caribbean, and the centerpiece of that network was 90 miles from Florida, Cuba. To Chapter 5, the Havana Empire. Cuba in the 1940s and 50s was a complicated place. Beautiful beaches, vibrant culture, but also massive inequality and a government that was increasingly corrupt and authoritarian. Fulgencio Batista ruled Cuba, first as an elected president, then as a dictator after a coup in 1952. He was not a particularly idealistic leader. He was interested in staying in power and in making money. Lots of money. Batista understood that Cuba's proximity to the United States made it valuable. American tourists wanted tropical destinations. They wanted places where they could do things that were illegal back home. Gambling, for instance. In 1939, Batista brought in Meyer Lansky as a consultant. The official story was that Meyer would help clean up Cuban gambling, make it more professional, make it more attractive to high-rolling American tourists. The reality was more complex. Meyer saw Cuba as an opportunity to build something he could never build in the United States, a casino empire with government backing. Batista's government offered extraordinary incentives to casino developers, tax holidays, duty-free importation of gambling equipment, fast-track licensing for hotel casino projects over a certain size. In exchange, casino operators paid, not official taxes but unofficial payments, to Batista personally, to his associates, to the people who made the Cuban government function. It was corruption, obviously. But from Meyer's perspective, it was also business. You paid for access, you paid for protection, and in return, you operated freely. Meyer didn't just invest in Cuban casinos. He helped create the entire system. He standardized rules. He reduced cheating, which was rampant in Cuban casinos before his involvement. He trained dealers and managers. He created an environment where wealthy Americans felt comfortable gambling large sums of money. His flagship project was the Riviera Hotel in Havana, a luxury property that opened in the late 1950s. Beautiful building, professional casino operation, everything designed to attract the wealthiest tourists. Meyer wasn't the public face of the Riviera. He rarely was the public face of anything. But people who understood the Cuban gambling scene knew he was involved, knew he was one of the major players. During the peak years of the 1950s, Meyer's influence in Cuba was extraordinary. he was described by some observer as an informal gaming minister, the person who actually controlled how casinos operated, regardless of what Cuban law officially said. He had relationships with Batista and his inner circle. He could get approvals that others couldn't. He could resolve disputes. He could make things happen. It was the closest Meyer Lansky ever came to operating openly as a major criminal power broker. In Cuba, his role was barely hidden. Everyone knew who he was and what he represented. For Meyer, Cuba represented the peak of his visible wealth and power. His casinos were generating enormous profits. His investments were paying off. His relationship with Batista seemed stable. He was in his 50s. He'd survived decades in organized crime without ever being seriously prosecuted. He'd helped build the national crime syndicate. He'd established casino operations in Las Vegas and Cuba. He'd accumulated what many people estimated to be a massive fortune. From the outside, Meyer Lansky looked untouchable, like he'd figured out how to be a major organized crime figure without suffering the consequences that usually came with that position. But history was about to intervene in a way that even Meyer Lansky couldn't predict or prepare for. A young revolutionary named Fidel Castro was gathering support in the Cuban mountains. He was promising to overthrow Batista, to end corruption, to reclaim Cuba for Cubans. Most people didn't take Castro seriously at first. Batista had the army. He had American support. He had all the advantages. But revolutions don't always follow logical predictions, and the Cuban Revolution was about to destroy Meyer Lansky's empire. Chapter 6: Castro, Collapse, and the Missing Millions. 1959. Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces marched into Havana. Batista fled the country. The old government collapsed almost overnight. For Meyer Lansky, this was catastrophic. Castro's revolutionaries immediately targeted the casinos. They represented everything Castro opposed: American influence, corruption, inequality, the exploitation of Cuba for foreign profit. The new government seized the casinos. No compensation, no negotiation, just seizure. Meyer's Riviera Hotel was taken. His other investments were taken. Everything he'd built in Cuba over 20 years was suddenly gone. The financial loss was staggering. Estimates vary, but Meyer may have lost the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in assets. Maybe more. He tried to fight back, or at least to negotiate. But Castro's government wasn't interested in deals. They wanted the Americans out. They wanted the mob out. They wanted to completely remake Cuban society. Meyer returned to the United States having lost a major portion of his visible wealth. The Havana casinos that had generated enormous profits were now Cuban state property. Years later, his heirs would attempt to claim compensation for the seized Riviera. They would argue that the property was taken illegally, that they deserved restitution. But that was decades in the future. In 1959, Meyer was facing the immediate reality that a huge portion of his empire had vanished. He still had Las Vegas interests. He still had various other investments and operations. But Cuba had been special. It had been the place where he'd operated most openly, most successfully. Now it was gone. The Cuba disaster also coincided with increasing pressure from American law enforcement. The FBI had been building files on Meyer for decades. They knew he was important. They knew he was wealthy. They just couldn't prove exactly how he'd earned that wealth or where he'd hidden it. In the early 1960s, the Kefauver Committee hearings investigated organized crime across America. Meyer was called to testify. He appeared, but invoked his Fifth Amendment rights repeatedly. He didn't deny being involved in gambling operations. He just refused to provide details that could be used to prosecute him. The hearings publicly named Meyer as one of the top organized crime figures in the country. He was no longer a background figure known only to other criminals and law enforcement. He was now a public figure, a famous criminal. This kind of attention made everything harder. It made banking more difficult. It made investing more difficult. It made maintaining the low profile Meyer had always preferred impossible. But Meyer adapted. He'd been adapting his entire life. And he had a strategy for dealing with the primary threat that eventually took down criminals like Al Capone. Taxes. Capone had been famously prosecuted for tax evasion. The government couldn't prove his bootlegging operations, his violence, his various crimes, but they could prove he had income he didn't report, that he paid no taxes on enormous amounts of money. Meyer had watched Capone's prosecution carefully. He'd learned from it. He understood that in modern America, you couldn't just accumulate wealth and never pay taxes. The government would eventually catch you, so Meyer developed a different strategy. He would move his money out of the United States entirely, to places where American tax authorities couldn't reach it. Switzerland became his primary destination. Chapter 7. Swiss Banks and the Architecture of Money. Laundering. The 1934 Swiss Banking Act changed international finance. It guaranteed strict secrecy for bank accounts. It made it illegal for Swiss banks to reveal client information to foreign governments. For legitimate business people, this was about privacy and security. For criminals, it was a gift. Meyer Lansky understood the implications immediately. If you could move money to Switzerland, you could hide it from American authorities. You could avoid taxes. You could create a financial fortress that was essentially impenetrable. But moving money to Switzerland wasn't simple. You couldn't just walk into a bank with suitcases of cash. You needed structure. You needed legitimate-looking businesses that could transfer money internationally. You needed layers of transactions that obscured the source of the funds. Meyer built those structures. He created or controlled various businesses that appeared legitimate. Import-export companies, investment firms, small banks. These entities could receive criminal profits, then transfer them internationally as part of normal business operations. He used Swiss banks not just to store money, but to launder it. Dirty money would go in through one channel, get mixed with legitimate funds, then come out looking clean through another channel. Some accounts suggest Meyer went even further, that he purchased an offshore Swiss bank, that he used that bank as a central pivot point for laundering money through layers of shell corporations. The specifics are murky. Swiss banking secrecy means we'll never know exactly what Meyer did or how much money he moved. But the pattern is clear. He pioneered techniques that would later become standard for international money laundering. This financial sophistication is what truly set Meyer apart from other criminals of his era. Most mobsters understood violence. Many understood extortion and gambling. But very few understood international finance, offshore banking, and the legal frameworks that allowed money to move across borders. Meyer did. And that understanding made him invaluable to the syndicate. He became the person who could help other mobsters hide their wealth, who could structure their investments, who could protect them from the kind of tax prosecution that had destroyed Al Capone. There was a cost to this role, though. The more Meyer's name was associated with offshore banking and money laundering, the more law enforcement focused on him. The FBI wanted to break his systems. They wanted to prove exactly how much money he'd hidden and where. Through the 1960s, investigations intensified. Meyer was watched constantly. His associates were interviewed. His financial transactions were scrutinized as much as possible given Swiss secrecy laws. He remained careful. He didn't flaunt wealth. He lived relatively modestly in Miami Beach. He didn't draw unnecessary attention to himself. But the pressure was building. And by the end of the 1960s, Meyer was facing a decision. He was in his late 60s. He'd been involved in organized crime for 50 years. He'd accumulated wealth, though exactly how much was unclear. He could stay in the United States and continue facing investigations and potential prosecutions. Or he could leave, find somewhere he could live out his remaining years without constant pressure. He chose to leave. His destination was surprising to many people. Not Switzerland, where his money was. Not some tropical island where he could hide. Israel. Chapter 8. The Israel Gambit, 1970. Meyer Lansky left the United States and flew to Israel. He applied for citizenship under the Law of Return, which grants Jewish people the right to settle in Israel and receive citizenship. On paper, it seemed logical. Meyer was Jewish. He'd experienced anti-Semitism in Russia as a child. He'd lived through an era when being Jewish in America meant facing discrimination. Israel was the Jewish homeland. Why shouldn't he be allowed to settle there? But of course, it wasn't that simple. Israeli authorities were immediately under enormous pressure from the United States. American law enforcement made it clear they considered Meyer a major organized crime figure. They wanted him prosecuted. They wanted him returned to the United States to face charges. The Israeli government was in a difficult position. The law of return was important symbolically and legally. It represented Israel's commitment to being a refuge for Jewish people worldwide. Denying Meyer's application would set a concerning precedent, but granting citizenship to a famous American mobster would create massive problems with the United States. Israel depended on American political and financial support. Harboring Meyer Lansky could jeopardize that relationship. The debate played out over 2 years. Meyer fought for his citizenship. He argued that he'd never been convicted of serious crimes, that he was being persecuted for being Jewish and successful, that he deserved the same rights as any other Jewish person. Israeli courts heard his case. Arguments were made. Evidence was presented. In 1972, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled against him. They found that his criminal past could endanger public welfare, that granting him citizenship would damage Israel's relationship with the United States, that the law of return, while broad, didn't require accepting everyone regardless of their history. Meyer was given a short period to leave. He couldn't stay in Israel, and he was running out of countries that would accept him. He tried a few other destinations. None worked out. Eventually, he had no choice but to return to the United States. This was a humiliating defeat for Meyer. He tried to use his Jewish heritage to escape prosecution. Instead, he'd been publicly rejected by Israel. The myth of his power and influence had taken a serious hit. When he returned to Miami in 1972, federal authorities were waiting. They'd spent 2 years building a case. They were ready to prosecute. The charge was tax evasion, the same charge that had taken down Capone. The government argued that Meyer had significant income from various sources and had failed to pay taxes on it. Meyer hired excellent lawyers. The case went to trial in Miami. The prosecution presented evidence of his gambling operations, his casino interests, his various income sources. But they couldn't prove the critical details. They couldn't show exactly how much money Meyer had earned. They couldn't access his Swiss bank accounts. They couldn't demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that he'd hidden specific amounts of taxable income. Meyer was acquitted. It was a stunning victory. The government had thrown significant resources at the case. They'd had years to build it, and they'd lost, but the victory came at a cost. Meyer was now in his 70s. He'd spent a fortune on legal fees. The stress of the trial had been enormous. His health was declining, and questions remained, questions that would follow Meyer for the rest of his life and beyond. Where was all the money? Chapter 9. The $300 million legend. The story of Meyer Lansky's missing fortune became one of organized crime's most persistent mysteries. The number most often cited was $300 million. According to various government sources and journalists, Meyer had accumulated approximately $300 million by the late 1960s. This money was supposedly hidden in Swiss bank accounts, invested through shell corporations, tucked away in places American authorities couldn't reach. $300 million in the 1960s would be worth far more today. It represented an almost unimaginable fortune. The figure came primarily from a journalist named Hank Messick. Messick wrote several books about Meyer and organized crime. He reported the 300 million number based on law enforcement sources and his own investigations. The number was repeated in other books, in news articles and documentaries. It became accepted fact. Meyer Lansky, the mob's accountant, had hidden $300 million. The story was compelling. It fit perfectly with Meyer's reputation. Of course, the financial genius of organized crime had hidden a massive fortune. Of course, he'd been too smart to let the government find it. But there was a problem with the story. A big problem. When Meyer Lansky died in 1983, his estate revealed something shocking. He had less than $35,000 in his bank accounts. No secret Swiss accounts were discovered, no hidden investments revealed, no $300 million. How was this possible? Where did the money go? Several explanations have been proposed. First, Cuba. When Castro seized Meyer's casinos, he didn't just take buildings, he took years of investment, equipment, operating capital, future profit streams. The financial loss was catastrophic and immediate. Second, legal fees. Meyer spent decades fighting various investigations and prosecutions. He hired the best lawyers available. That kind of defense doesn't come cheap. Over the years, legal fees may have consumed millions. Third, family expenses. Meyer had children, including a son named Buddy, who suffered from severe disabilities. Medical care and support for Buddy was expensive and ongoing. Meyer reportedly spent substantial amounts ensuring his son received proper care. Fourth, the nature of Meyer's wealth. It's possible that the $300 million figure was never accurate, or that it represented money Meyer had managed or moved for others, but not money that was actually his. In organized crime, the person who controls money doesn't always own it. Meyer managed money for the syndicate, for various criminal operations, for other mobsters who trusted his financial expertise. Managing $300 million is very different from having $300 million. The distinction matters. It's also possible that some of Meyer's wealth was lost through bad investments, through market changes, through the various economic upheavals of the 1970s. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Meyer had been wealthy at various points, but wealth in organized crime is fragile. It can disappear quickly. And Meyer lived long enough to see much of his disappear. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas, which has extensively researched Meyer's life, concludes that the $300 million figure was likely exaggerated, that Meyer died with relatively modest assets, that the legend of his hidden fortune is more myth than reality. But the legend persists, because it's such a good story. The criminal mastermind who outwitted everyone, who hid a fortune that has never been found. People want to believe in that story. They want to believe that somewhere, in some Swiss bank vault, $300 million is still waiting for someone to figure out Meyer's system, to crack his codes, to claim the fortune. It makes Meyer's life seem more dramatic, more successful, more romantic in a way. The reality is probably sadder. Meyer Lansky spent his entire life accumulating wealth and power. He was brilliant at it. But in the end, he lost most of what he'd built. Cuba was seized, legal fees mounted, his health failed, his influence waned. He died in Miami Beach, in a modest apartment, with little money and failing health. Not the ending you'd expect for the mob's accountant. Not the ending that fits the legend, but perhaps a more honest ending. A reminder that in the long run, crime doesn't actually pay. That the wealth accumulated through illegal means is never secure. That no matter how smart you are, how careful you are, the house always wins eventually. Or maybe that's too moralistic. Maybe Meyer did hide money that was never found. Maybe the legend is true, and the $300 million is still out there somewhere. We'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty is part of what makes Meyer Lansky's story so compelling. The Chapter 10, Miami Beach and the Final Years. After the failed Israel Gambit and the tax evasion trial, Meyer settled into a strange kind of semi-retirement in Miami Beach. He was famous now in a way he'd never wanted to be. The Kefauver hearings had made him a public figure. Books had been written about him. He was recognized on the street. but he tried to maintain a normal life. He walked his dogs, ate at local restaurants. He lived in a modest apartment with his second wife, Teddy. Neighbors and acquaintances from this period described him as polite, quiet, almost ordinary. An elderly man who seemed more like a retired accountant than a legendary mobster. But law enforcement never stopped watching. They still believed he had hidden wealth. They still believed he was involved in ongoing criminal operations. They couldn't accept that Meyer Lansky was just quietly fading into old age. Meyer had married twice. His first marriage produced children, including Buddy, the son with disabilities who required constant care. Meyer's devotion to Buddy was genuine. He made sure his son had the best medical care and support available. His second wife, Teddy, stayed with him through the difficult final years. Through the legal battles, the declining health, the fading influence. Meyer's health deteriorated through the late 1970s and early 80s. He developed lung cancer. He'd been a lifelong smoker, and it caught up with him. He continued living in Miami Beach, but his world was shrinking. The old partners were mostly dead or in prison. The syndicate he'd helped build had evolved into something different. The casinos he'd influenced in Las Vegas were being bought by corporations. The world was changing, and Meyer's kind of organized crime, personal relationships, handshake deals, hidden partnerships, was becoming obsolete. Corporate gaming didn't need mob accountants. It had actual accountants, CPAs with degrees and licenses, financial systems that were sophisticated without being criminal. Meyer had helped create the template for legitimate-looking casino operations. Now, legitimate casino operations were using that template without needing people like Meyer at all. It's a particular kind of success and failure combined. He'd helped create something that eventually made him irrelevant. January 15th, 1983. Meyer Lansky died in Miami Beach. He was 80 years old. The official cause was lung cancer. His funeral was small and private. Family and a few old friends. No mob spectacle, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet ending for a man who'd spent his entire life trying to stay quiet. When his will was probated and his estate examined, the truth became clear. There was no hidden fortune, no $300 million, just modest assets and some debts. Federal investigators were apparently shocked. They'd believed for decades that Meyer had enormous hidden wealth. They'd assumed that when he died, the money trail would finally be revealed. Instead, there was almost nothing, an ordinary estate for an ordinary man. Except Meyer Lansky had been anything but ordinary. The disconnect between the legend and the reality sparked decades of speculation. Books were written arguing that Meyer must have hidden the money so well that even his estate couldn't find it. That there were secret accounts no one knew about. That the fortune was still out there. Others argued that the modest estate was proof the legend had always been exaggerated. That Meyer had been important and influential. Yes, but not as wealthy as people believed. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. Meyer had been wealthy at times, but he'd also lost enormous amounts, and he'd lived long enough to see most of his empire crumble. What remained at his death was not a fortune, but a legacy that would influence organized crime, law enforcement, and popular culture for decades to come. Chapter 11. The Legacy of the Mob's Accountant. Meyer Lansky's true legacy isn't measured in dollars hidden or found. It's measured in the systems he created and the ways he changed organized crime. Before Meyer, organized crime was largely disorganized. Street gangs, ethnic rivalries, short-term thinking, violence as the primary tool for resolving disputes. Meyer helped transform all of that. He showed that cooperation was more profitable than conflict, that long-term planning beat short-term opportunism, that financial sophistication could provide protection that violence alone never could. The National Crime Syndicate was his most obvious structural contribution. The idea that different criminal groups could work together systematically was revolutionary. It changed how organized crime operated across America. But Meyer's influence went deeper than organizational structure. He helped establish the model of using legitimate businesses as fronts and money laundering vehicles. The idea that criminals should invest in legal enterprises wasn't new, but Meyer systematized it. He showed how it could be done at scale. He pioneered offshore banking for criminal purposes. The use of Swiss accounts, shell corporations, and international transfers to hide wealth became standard practice after Meyer demonstrated how effective it could be. He proved that casinos were the perfect criminal enterprise. They generated enormous cash flows that were difficult to track. They provided legitimate business covers. They allowed for sophisticated skimming operations. After Meyer's work in Las Vegas and Cuba, every major organized crime group wanted casino interests. These innovations might seem technical, almost boring compared to the drama of mob violence, but they are more important than any individual hit or power struggle. They changed the fundamental nature of organized crime in America. Meyer also changed law enforcement's approach to organized crime. The investigations into his offshore banking operations helped federal authorities understand how money laundering worked. The techniques developed to track Meyer's finances became templates for investigating other criminals. The concept of following the money, of focusing prosecutions on financial crimes rather than trying to prove specific violent acts, came partly from the frustration of trying to prosecute Meyer. He was too careful, too smart, too removed from direct criminal activity. But money left trails. Even offshore money, even carefully laundered money, left some evidence. Law enforcement learned to find and exploit those trails. In popular culture, Meyer became the archetype of the criminal mastermind. Not flashy like Capone, not brutal like some of his contemporaries, but intelligent, calculating, and ultimately mysterious. The character of Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part 2 was clearly based on Meyer, the aging Jewish mobster with Cuban casino interests and a calm, businesslike demeanor. The character even mirrors specific events from Meyer's life, including the Cuba Revolution and the failed attempt to find refuge in Israel. Various films and books have tried to capture Meyer's story. The 1999 TV movie Lansky starred Richard Dreyfuss. The 2021 film Lansky with Harvey Keitel tried to explore the mystery of the missing fortune. None of these portrayals fully capture the real Meyer Lansky, because the real Meyer was careful never to fully reveal himself. He understood that mystery was a form of protection, that if people didn't know exactly what you did or how much you had, they couldn't effectively move against you. That strategy worked for decades. Meyer avoided prison when many of his contemporaries died behind bars. He avoided assassination when violence was commonplace in organized crime. He lived to 80 when many mobsters died young. But the strategy also meant that his true story, his real influence, remained partially hidden. We know the broad strokes. We know he was important. We know he changed things. But the details, the specific operations, the exact financial arrangements, much of that died with Meyer, and perhaps that's how he would have wanted it. There's something fitting about Meyer Lansky remaining partially mysterious even after his death. It mirrors how he lived, always in the background, always slightly out of focus, always leaving people to wonder exactly what he knew and what he controlled. Chapter 12. The paradox at the heart of the story. Meyer Lansky lived his entire life in pursuit of wealth and security. He wanted to escape the poverty of his childhood. He wanted to ensure his family would be provided for. He wanted the respect and influence that came with financial success. He achieved much of this. He became wealthy, at least for periods of his life. He gained enormous influence in organized crime. He was respected and feared by people who respected and feared very few. But in the end, he died with almost nothing. His Cuban empire was seized. His hidden fortune, if it existed, was never found. His estate was modest. His influence had waned. This is the paradox at the heart of Meyer's story. He was brilliant at accumulating wealth, but that wealth was built on illegal foundations that proved unsustainable. Every success contained the seeds of future failure. The casinos that made him rich attracted law enforcement attention that eventually made those operations untenable. The offshore accounts that protected his wealth also made him a target for investigations. The relationships that gave him power also drew him into conflicts and obligations he couldn't escape. Meyer understood this paradox, at least intellectually. He'd watched enough criminals rise and fall to know that nothing was permanent in organized crime, that success could evaporate overnight, that the wealth accumulated through illegal means was always vulnerable to seizure, to legal action, to political changes. But understanding something intellectually is different from accepting it emotionally. Meyer kept playing the game even when the odds turned against him. He kept pursuing wealth even as his empire crumbled. He kept believing that his intelligence and careful planning would somehow insulate him from the fate of other criminals. They didn't. They couldn't. Because the fundamental problem wasn't with Meyer's execution of his strategy. It was with the strategy itself. You cannot build something lasting on an illegal foundation. No matter how sophisticated your money laundering, how careful your organization, how intelligent your planning, you're building on sand. And eventually, the tide comes in. For Meyer, the tide came in multiple forms. Castro's revolution, increasing law enforcement pressure, the corporatization of Las Vegas, the evolution of banking regulations that made offshore accounts less secure, age and illness. Any one of these might have been survivable. All of them together were overwhelming. By the time Meyer died, the world he'd helped create had moved on without him. The national crime syndicate had evolved into something different. The casino industry he'd helped build was going corporate. The financial techniques he'd pioneered were being used by others, often better capitalized and better protected. Meyer had been a pioneer. But pioneers often don't get to enjoy what they pioneer. They blaze trails that others follow and commercialize and make safe. That's what happened to Meyer's innovations in organized crime. He showed the way. Others followed. And eventually, the people following his path had advantages he never had. Legal protections, legitimate business structures, government approvals. The irony is profound. Meyer spent his life trying to make criminal enterprises look legitimate. His dream was casinos that appeared respectable, financial systems that seemed clean, organizations that operated like corporations. And eventually, those dreams were realized. Just not by Meyer, by actual corporations, by legitimate businesses that took the casino model he'd helped refine and made it legal, taxable, respectable. Las Vegas today is exactly what Meyer envisioned, except without the crime. Corporate-owned casinos, professional operations, massive profits flowing to shareholders and investors. Meyer helped create that world, but he couldn't participate in it because he'd come from the illegal side, and that origin was a permanent stain that no amount of sophistication could wash away. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of Meyer Lansky's life. Intelligence alone isn't enough. Strategy alone isn't enough. You can be the smartest person in the room and still end up with nothing if you're building on the wrong foundation. Meyer built on crime. And no matter how smart he was about it, that foundation was always going to collapse eventually. On Chapter 13. Questions that remain. Even after all the investigations, all the books, all the documentaries, questions about Meyer Lansky remain. The most obvious, where did the money go? If he really controlled hundreds of millions at some point, what happened to it? We've explored the possible answers. Cuba, legal fees, family expenses, the possibility that the money was never really his, the possibility that the 300 million figure was always exaggerated. But these answers feel incomplete. They explain how Meyer could have lost money. They don't definitively prove he did lose it all. Could there still be hidden accounts? Secret investments no one knows about? Some elaborate financial structure that's still out there, still containing Meyer's fortune? It's possible. Unlikely, but possible. Meyer was careful and sophisticated. If anyone could have hidden money so well that it's never been found, it would be him. But the simpler explanation is probably correct. He lost it. Through bad luck, through circumstances beyond his control, through the cost of living and fighting legal battles and supporting his family, the fortune dissipated. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just gradually, over years, as opportunities closed and expenses mounted and the world changed around him. Another question: what was Meyer's real role in various historical events? In murders, for instance. In decisions that shaped organized crime. Meyer was careful to stay removed from direct violence, but he participated in decisions that led to violence. He attended meetings where murders were discussed and approved. He benefited from enforcement that relied on the threat and reality of killing. How responsible was he? Legally, morally, historically? The legal system couldn't definitively answer that question while he was alive. He was never convicted of murder, never even charged in most cases, because prosecutors couldn't draw direct lines between him and specific killings. But everyone knew he was involved at some level. Everyone knew that Murder Incorporated existed partly because people like Meyer financially supported it, that the syndicate's enforcement mechanisms required his participation and approval. So was Meyer a killer? Not with his own hands, but perhaps with his ledgers and his strategies and his willingness to be part of systems that killed. The question is complicated by the fact that Meyer saw himself as a businessman. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was different from violent criminals, that his intelligence and sophistication made him something else. But this was self-deception. Meyer was part of an inherently violent enterprise. The fact that he delegated the violence, that he kept it at arm's length, didn't make him less culpable. It just made him more careful. Another question: what did Meyer really think about his life? About his choices? About the systems he had helped create? In his few interviews and public statements, Meyer presented himself as a businessman who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement, who'd done nothing wrong, or at least nothing that legitimate businessmen didn't also do. This was partly performance, obviously. He couldn't admit to crimes in public statements. But it's possible he'd told himself these stories so often that he partly believed them. People are good at rationalizing their choices, at finding explanations that make them feel less guilty. Meyer had a lifetime to develop such rationalizations. Did he ever have doubts, regrets? Did he ever wonder if he should have chosen differently? If he should have used his obvious intelligence and business acumen in legitimate enterprises instead of criminal ones? We'll never know. Meyer didn't leave confessional memoirs. He didn't reveal his inner thoughts. He maintained his carefully constructed public persona until the end. But we can speculate. A man who ended his life with almost nothing after having controlled so much must have had some regrets, must have wondered what might have been if he'd chosen differently. Or maybe not. Maybe Meyer believed until the end that he played the game brilliantly, that his successes outweighed his failures, that he'd lived an extraordinary life that was worth the costs. Both interpretations are possible. Both are supported by different aspects of his story. The ambiguity is frustrating for people who want clear answers, who want to know definitively who Meyer was, what he did, what he believed. But ambiguity is perhaps the most honest representation of Meyer Lansky's life. He was a person who lived in shadows, who built systems designed to obscure truth, who succeeded by never revealing too much. That he remains partially mysterious even now is fitting. It's the last victory of a man who understood that knowledge is power, and that keeping others from knowing everything about you is one of the most effective forms of protection. Chapter 14. The man behind the legend. Strip away the mythology. Strip away the $300 million and the Swiss bank accounts and the casino empires. What remains? A boy named Meyer Lansky, who left Grodno in 1911 and arrived in New York's Lower East Side. A child who grew up poor in a country that wasn't always welcoming to immigrants. A young man who saw limited legitimate opportunities and chose the path that seemed available. That choice, made probably without fully understanding its implications, shaped everything that followed. Meyer could have gone straight. With his intelligence and business sense, he probably could have been successful in legitimate enterprises. But the legitimate world in the early 20th century wasn't particularly open to poor Jewish immigrants. The barriers were real. The discrimination was real. The economic opportunities were limited. Crime offered something different, a meritocracy of sorts. If you were smart and tough and willing to take risks, you could rise. Your background didn't matter as much. Your ethnicity, while still relevant, wasn't the absolute barrier it was in many legitimate fields. Meyer chose crime not because he was evil, but because it was the path that made sense given his circumstances. That's not an excuse, but it is context. The choices that followed, partnering with Bugsy Siegel, allying with Lucky Luciano, helping build the syndicate, investing in casinos, developing money laundering systems. These weren't inevitable. Meyer made active choices at each stage, but they were choices made within contexts, within systems, within the logic of organized crime that, once entered, is difficult to leave. By the time Meyer was 30, he was deeply embedded in organized crime. He had relationships, obligations, reputation. He couldn't just walk away, even if he'd wanted to. And he probably didn't want to. He was good at what he did. He was respected. He was making money. From his perspective, he'd succeeded. The personal toll is harder to assess. Meyer married twice. He had children. He tried to maintain family relationships while living a life of crime. His son Buddy's disabilities required enormous care and resources. Meyer devoted significant attention and money to ensuring Buddy was properly cared for. This suggests a capacity for love and responsibility that doesn't fit neatly with the cold, calculating mobster image. Meyer was also, by most accounts, personally non-violent. He didn't carry guns. He didn't personally assault people. He resolved disputes through negotiation when possible. This doesn't make him less culpable for the syndicate's violence, but it does suggest that Meyer himself wasn't particularly sadistic or violent in temperament. He saw violence as a business tool, not as something to be enjoyed. In his later years, living in Miami Beach, he apparently tried to be a good neighbor. He was polite. He helped people when he could. He tried to live a quiet, normal life despite his reputation. Were these glimpses of Meyer's real personality? Or just performances by a man who'd spent his life performing? Probably both. People are complicated. Meyer could genuinely care about his son, while also participating in organizations that killed people. He could be kind to neighbors while having amassed wealth through illegal means. He could want to be seen as a legitimate businessman while knowing his fortune came from crime. These contradictions don't resolve. They're not supposed to. They're part of who Meyer was, a complicated person living a complicated life in a complicated time. The challenge in telling Meyer's story is avoiding simple narratives. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't quite a traditional villain either. He wasn't a victim of circumstances, but circumstances certainly shaped his options and choices. He was a man who made choices, some brilliant and some catastrophic, and lived with the consequences of those choices for 80 years. At the end, alone with his wife in a modest Miami Beach apartment, dying of lung cancer. What did Meyer think about his life? We'll never know, but we can imagine an old man reflecting on extraordinary experiences, remembering friends long dead, recalling empires built and lost, wondering if it had all been worth it. The wealth was gone. The power was gone. The influence was gone. What remained? Memories. A family. A legacy that would be debated and studied for generations. Maybe that was enough for Meyer. Maybe he found peace in having lived fully, even if that life was criminal. Or maybe he died with regrets, with wishes that things had been different, with understanding that his brilliance had been applied to endeavors that ultimately couldn't last. Both interpretations honor the complexity of Meyer Lansky's life. both acknowledge that he was more than just the mob's accountant. He was a person, flawed, brilliant, ambitious, careful, calculating, and human. And that humanity, more than any amount of hidden money or criminal achievements, is what makes his story worth telling. Chapter 15. The Final Accounting. In the end, how do we measure a life like Meyer Lansky's? By the money he accumulated? If so, his life was a failure. He died with little, having lost most of what he'd built. By his influence? If so, his life was successful. He fundamentally changed organized crime. His innovations, the syndicate, the casino model, offshore money laundering, shaped criminal enterprises for generations. By his personal relationships? That's harder to judge. He had friends, but many were business relationships that ended in betrayal or violence. He had family, and by most accounts tried to be a good father and husband despite his profession. By his legacy? That depends on perspective. Law enforcement sees him as a cautionary tale. Other criminals might see him as an inspiration. Historians see him as important regardless of moral judgment. Meyer himself would probably have wanted to be judged by his wealth and influence. He spent his life pursuing both. But near the end, with the wealth gone and influence fading, what did he have left? He had the satisfaction, perhaps, of having played the game at the highest level, of having been important, of having mattered. For someone who started as an immigrant child in the Lower East Side, who faced poverty and discrimination and limited opportunities, becoming one of the most important figures in 20th century organized crime was an achievement. A perverse achievement, perhaps, but an achievement nonetheless. Meyer also had the knowledge that he'd survived. So many of his contemporaries died young, killed in mob wars, executed by their own organizations, imprisoned until they died behind bars. Meyer lived free until his 80s. He avoided serious prison time. He died in his own home, surrounded by family, not in a cell or in a violent ambush. By the standards of organized crime, that's success. Most criminals don't get to die of old age in their own beds. But by broader standards, by the standards of what a human life can accomplish and mean, Meyer's life was more ambiguous. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. His intelligence and strategic thinking were exceptional, but he applied those gifts to organized crime, to helping criminals operate more efficiently, to building systems that harm people and communities. What could Meyer have accomplished if he'd applied his talents to legitimate enterprises, to building businesses rather than criminal organizations? We'll never know, and that's perhaps the saddest part of his story. All that intelligence, all that capability, channeled into something that ultimately couldn't last. That was always going to end badly. That left him with almost nothing despite decades of effort. Meyer's life poses questions about opportunity and choice in America, about what options are really available to poor immigrants, about how talent gets channeled toward or away from crime based on circumstances. These are complicated questions without easy answers, but they're worth asking. Because understanding how someone like Meyer becomes who he became helps us understand the social conditions that create organized crime. It's easy to judge Meyer from a distance, to condemn his choices and his life. And that judgment isn't wrong. He did help run criminal organizations that hurt people. But judgment without understanding is incomplete. Meyer wasn't a monster. He was a person responding to circumstances, making choices that made sense within his context, pursuing goals that seemed worthwhile from his perspective, that his choices led to a life of crime, that his goals required breaking laws and harming others, that his perspective was ultimately self-serving. All of that is true, but it doesn't capture the full complexity of who he was and why. The story of Meyer Lansky is the story of America in some ways. Immigrants arriving, finding opportunities, both legitimate and criminal, building empires, chasing wealth, believing in the possibility of remaking yourself into something new. But it's also a story about the limits of that dream, about how wealth built on illegal foundations is unstable, about how intelligence alone can't overcome the fundamental problems with crime as a life strategy. Meyer proved you could be the smartest criminal of your generation and still end up with almost nothing. That should be sobering for anyone tempted by organized crime. If Meyer Lansky, with all his genius and careful planning, couldn't make it work long term, who can? The answer is no one. Crime doesn't pay in the long run. The house always wins. The systems Meyer helped build eventually moved on without him, leaving him behind as an elderly man in Miami Beach, dying of cancer, mostly forgotten except as a cautionary tale and unsolved mystery. That's the final accounting of Meyer Lansky's life. Brilliant, but flawed. Successful, but ultimately unsuccessful. Influential, but fading. Rich, but ending poor. Feared, but eventually pitied. A life lived at extremes. A story that still fascinates decades later. A man who changed organized crime forever, even as organized crime eventually left him behind. The mob's accountant, the financial genius of American crime, the architect of modern organized crime, and in the end, an old man with almost nothing, leaving behind questions that will never be fully answered and a legacy that will never be fully understood. That's Meyer Lansky. A story without a tidy ending, a life without simple judgments, a legend wrapped around a reality that was both more and less than the legend suggests. $300 million, or 35,000, casino empires or modest estates, criminal mastermind, or just another immigrant who chose the wrong path and stuck with it too long. Maybe all of it is true. Maybe none of it captures who Meyer really was. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Meyer Lansky was always meant to remain slightly out of focus, partially mysterious, never quite fully understood. The mob's accountant who kept his own books so carefully that even after death, we're still trying to balance them. Still trying to figure out what was real and what was legend. Still trying to understand how an immigrant kid from Grodno became one of the most important criminals in American history. And still trying to understand what, if anything, he had to show for it at the end. The ledger remains unbalanced. The accounts remain open. The questions remain unanswered. Perhaps they always will. Perhaps that's Meyer Lansky's final trick. To remain mysterious, even when everything else is gone. To die, leaving people wondering, still searching, still trying to find the missing millions, still trying to understand the man behind the legend. Meyer Lansky, 1902 to 1983. The mob's accountant, the architect of modern organized crime, the financial genius who died almost penniless. His story ends, but the questions remain, and maybe that's the most fitting legacy of all. For a man who spent his life in shadows, a little mystery seems appropriate at the end.